All right, let's get started. We're going to talk about, I think, what will be a very interesting topic here in the context of everything that's going on in our environment. So many of the companies that we're working with are facing some type of supply constraints. It's in the news pretty much every day due to the pandemic and other circumstances that are affecting this. So we thought it'd be a good idea to really talk about tactics for supply constrained conditions. You know, a lot of people think of Ddmrp as being about inventory reduction, and when in reality, we're really trying to promote flow and improve throughput for companies, but inventory does become clearly a center of focus. So in a supply constrained environment, you know, we don't have enough inventory, and how can we use the Ddmrp visibility and prioritization to better influence and help us manage our way through these difficult times? So we're going to go ahead and go through this. And this is one topic that for sure I would love to have a lot more audience participation. So if there's questions out there you want to ask or perspectives you can share, please use that Q&A button on the Zoom control panel, and we'll try to pick those up as we go through. From an agenda standpoint, we're going to talk about challenges in a supply constrained environment, some of the operational things. We'll talk about some of the relevant Ddmrp concepts that we can utilize to help us navigate and find our way through these difficult times. And then we'll talk about kind of the three primary dimensions we see. Hoarding by customers. A lot of times it's viewed as excess demand. You know, there's a lot of other ways of looking at it, but by and large, I'd say it's kind of the toilet paper syndrome on steroids, you know, that we've got this showing up in all sorts of different dimensions in the supply chain, where people are taking aggressive defensive actions, trying to accumulate material to insulate themselves from possible disruptions. And that's causing a lot of knock-on effects across the supply chain. So we've got a number of examples of tactics that we can apply in that environment. We'll talk about those. Then on the supply constraints, how do we manage and work with our vendors and our suppliers and our own operations to do the best we can with what we have to work with? And then one of the other kind of knock-on effects we've seen from the current environment is that people are starting to drive and ask for longer lead times, which, as we'll try to point out, is actually quite counterproductive to what we should be doing. And so we want to use this as a chance to kind of frame this topic, give you some more ideas and things you can be thinking about in terms of how we can leverage these concepts to find our way through. And obviously, if you do have ideas or questions you want to contribute to the discussion here, please do so, and we'll follow those up on those as we go through the material. So I'll take a few minutes and we'll just kind of frame this subject here, and then we'll get into the tactics. Clearly, as we've come out of the pandemic, and whether it's been related to all of the government subsidies that were deployed in the US and around the world, whether it was just a lot of built up demand, I don't know. We can all speculate on what's really driving it, but the economies are hot around the world. And so there's very, very strong economic conditions which are driving demand in aggregate. Forget, you know, hoarding behaviors and other specific responses from the pandemic. The economy otherwise is in, you know, very good shape globally. Yes, there are challenges out there, but there's a lot of demand out in the market. And that demand signal that we're talking about, we have to understand and discern a bit better. And we'll talk about some thoughts on that going in. At the same time, we've got lack of material availability, and it's impacting on time and full rates. Probably one of the best examples is automobiles, where now, you know, because of lack of supply at the dealerships, dealers are asking as much as a $10,000 premium on the list price of a car, where typically you'd be able to get a discount off the list price. So the cost of automobiles has gone up dramatically, in part because of the scarcity that they're dealing with. We also see that the supply constraints are not shared equally, meaning that certain segments seem to be doing much better than others. Obviously, the most notable one that you hear about all the time is chip shortages, really impacting automotive. But, you know, in other industries, certain materials are becoming more problematic than others. And so that imbalance is part of the dimension that we need to be understanding and dealing with, because that's going to affect not only your own supply situation, but your customers. So if you're in a B2B environment, your customers are seeing shortages in some materials, it's going to restrict their total consumption of the materials you supply to them, even if you're in good position to supply what they're asking for. So a lot of knock-on effects there. In some cases, we've seen quality issues because of, I think often I've heard it described as being attributed back to short staffing, where because of, especially with the Omicron surge, people were really suffering to have enough talented or skilled resources in their environment, and that was causing some quality issues. So those are things that we have to consider. Obviously, the volatility in customer demand increases as the customers' supply issues impact their own production schedules. And I think probably the best example of this would be in automotive, where as the chip shortage really started to take root, and I'd say this started really becoming an issue in the second quarter of last year or thereabouts, we had seen our automotive supplier clients really seeing increases in rates of demand. Things were going great. And then all of a sudden, as we got towards the later part of the second quarter and into the third quarter, things slowed down dramatically. So there was really a slowdown in the rate of automobile production. And it was really the consequence of the fact that those supply shortages that they're experiencing are going to influence and impact on our business as a supplier. And we have to be better able to manage those because it's going to be an unreliable signal to work with. And now kind of the last kind of chapter that we've seen is this request by customers and suppliers to extend lead times. And I'll tell you, this is not going to improve the situation. I borrowed a chart from the DDOM presentation that we'll cover here in a few minutes. But we're actually going in the wrong direction when we think that these longer lead times are going to do anything beneficial for us. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So what are some of the key Ddmrp concepts we can work with? Buffer reconfiguration. We'll show you some examples on this. If we tune our buffers in a proper way, and it doesn't mean just making them bigger, because that's probably not necessarily going to help us, but we can do a better job of getting them positioned to help us understand where we should focus and take action, finding those points of leverage where we can gain more control of our environment. The buffers themselves provide status and prioritization. That's clearly one of the best benefits of Ddmrp and DDOM kind of concepts. So if we use those signals wisely, we get more focus on those areas that need the most critical need. Material availability checking, that's in our solution. It really helps us ensure, probably the biggest thing there will be to really ensure that we're not releasing work orders when we have known material availability checks. That may seem a bit counterintuitive that we have to even caution about that, but I've seen it often where companies will continue to approve orders even though they know they don't have the material, because there's this kind of built-in mindset that we can firefight our way through that. And I think in today's conditions, the success rate of those firefighting actions isn't going to be anything what it was perhaps in more normal times. Execution alerts are all about managing open supply. So they were really kind of built for these kind of conditions, and they can provide great insights around where you can focus. Supplier collaboration, we'll talk about this too. It's about building more constructive relationships. If you were on this morning for the discussion with John Spitali from Greif, he very much was illuminating those aspects and how building more trusting and closer relationships with our suppliers can help us dramatically. And then clearly recognizing that in your production environment, you've got limits. And so if you are bringing in far more supply than you're going to be able to consume, you're not really going to help yourself. So keep that in mind. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, before we dive into the tactics, let's just talk about what feedback we've seen from clients. We've had a number who are in the midst of large enterprise-wide rollouts on our platform. And the interesting thing about it, it provided a little bit of an A/B comparison, if you will, where they were able to monitor the performance on key supply chain metrics of those locations that had enabled Ddmrp versus those that were still running traditional MRP. And probably, the biggest factor that we saw was that they had improved material availability. Doesn't mean that they were perfect, and I'm not going to claim that at all or anything like that, but that they were more resilient, that they were more able to get through the crisis than peer locations that had not yet enabled Ddmrp and were still running the conventional methods that they had in place. Probably the more visible example was comparisons on rates of spending on expedite or fast freight to bring materials in to the plant, and that they definitely saw differences in the run rates of expedite spending for those sites that were on Ddmrp versus those that weren't. So, anecdotal, not real heavy scientific or a financial proof in great volumes or anything like that, but enough to know that it's frankly strengthened the resolve of some of those clients to further press forward on their Ddmrp rollouts around their organization. The other thing they've seen is this volatility in customer demand. Some of the clients we've seen have just a ridiculous amount of demand coming in, actual sales order demands that they're in no position to be able to satisfy because it exceeds the constraints of their operations, or because with labor issues due to COVID, illnesses restricting, the total workforce that they had available, they were not going to be able to achieve. And I think a lot of it really represented this, hoarding behavior that I think is very problematic, and we'll get into in a minute here. And then finally, the use of the execution alerts has really helped them improve their expedite actions. Again, the find a point of leverage, where do I focus my time and effort in the best way, and how can I get leverage out of that as best as possible? One thing for sure you need to do is you have to set what your company's strategy is, right? Because if you don't have that in mind, then you're just going to be kind of flailing in all sorts of different directions. And as I've met with clients, and I think Bernard's done the same, one of the key questions is, how do you prioritize? How do you triage, if you will, between all the different customer demands you have? Are you going to try to service all dimensions of your market equally? Are you going to prioritize key clients? In some cases, clients kind of throttle back their focus to, let's just make sure that our top 40, top 80%, whatever the percentage was of their materials, were really well controlled and focused, because they knew they didn't have the planning bandwidth to make everything line up or get resolved. So it's important to give some clear thought to what your strategy is, so that all the stakeholders in the company are on board with what you're trying to accomplish. That will, again, obviously help you align your actions accordingly. Supplier prioritization. In a similar way as you're prioritizing which customers are most critical and which needs do you really need to satisfy, you should also be looking at your suppliers. There's a Pareto curve where most of the money is going through, some subset of your supply community. How do you foster and really work those relationships at a much deeper level with those that really have the biggest impact on your success or failure in the market? Some may be having more trouble than others. Identify where those exposures are so that you can really deeply understand what's happening there and develop corrective actions for that. Whether it's, stability of lead times, availability of supply, perhaps there's alternate sources you can leverage. And where do you need focused expediting? Bernard will show you some examples around alerts like on offshore materials, where you may change freight strategies when the material comes available from the vendor between, say, sea freight and air freight, because of the influence on addressing the key customer needs that you're trying to address. And then, to whatever extent you can, build better insulation, so that you've got more stability within your own environment. If you can protect by appropriate buffering and appropriate tactics with your vendors, so that for the core part of the business that you're really most concerned with, that you have greater insulation from supply instability, obviously that's going to help you dramatically going forward. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's talk about hoarding. I use that word specifically. It's really this excessive demand. It's like that toilet paper syndrome that everybody saw erupt around the world as the COVID pandemic started. Everybody was so worried that they were going to run out that they went and cleaned off the shelves. And now the rate of consumption of that material is pretty much predictable. So it's not really changing. So it's an aberration, if you will, in the market. And we need to understand that, and we don't obviously want to contribute it to. So if we have demand far in excess of our capacity, and we don't do something about that, we are not only going to send a signal to our own operations, but also to our vendors if it's well beyond our ability to actually consume the material that we're talking about. So Bernard, let's talk about this concept of managing qualified demand.
Yeah, maybe before we jump in the various tactics we tried to list here. First, I think we should be clear on the fact that DDMRP and demand-driven operating model is not a magic one. So I see, for instance, a couple of questions that relate to lead times, and indeed, for instance, if you're working in the electronics manufacturing, some of the components that used to be 3 weeks of lead time not so long ago now are potentially 2 years of lead time. So that we're going through challenging times, and we've been going through challenging times for the past 2 years, and that is going to continue. So basically, what the demand-driven operating model and the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model is providing us with is some visibility to try and make better decisions and try and adapt to these changing environments. And of course, so we listed a few tactics, and the first set of tactics we'll go through are when we have more demand than we can satisfy with our own capacity. And we listed some recommendations. That doesn't mean it's exhaustive, comprehensive. That's clearly just some of the things and the good practices we've seen within our clients, and there are most likely other ones. So feel free to jump in and add your comments or contribute to the ITC. The first thing we wanted to touch on is that in the net flow equation, we start from qualified demand. So net flow is on hand plus on order minus qualified demand. And the worst thing you could do when you're running late because your capacity is not enabling you to stay current would be to let qualified demand accumulate in the past. We've seen that in some customers, and of course, this distorts the requirements you would place on your customers, and it is just adding more requirements on things you will not be able to consume. So it's important you do not let the qualified demand accumulate in the past, that you reschedule this demand, at least in the Ddmrp engine in the future, and potentially use that process to deprioritize some of your customer demand because you may not want to serve all customers equally. Erik, can you comment on this one?
Yeah, I think obviously we really need to be conscious about this because we've got one client that we're working with right now where the imbalance is so severe that it's ridiculous. And so what we're working with them on is a tactic to take kind of the output of an RCCP run as the demand signal that we're actually going to bring in to prioritize into the buffers or drive the buffer behavior. It's kind of an intermediate step, if you will, between the actual demand signal coming from the market to what's coming in, but it provides a very effective way of really controlling the amount of distortion that we're trying to manage within the operational environment. And that stability is really, really vital today. Otherwise, you've just got far too much amplification of bullwhip opportunity here working against you. So let me fast forward to our next slide.
The second tactic here is basically if you're short of capacity and you're manufacturing to stock, there is no use, keeping your inventory buffers at the normal size because you just cannot fulfill and cannot fill this buffer adequately. So if you're really short on capacity and cannot fulfill all demand and cannot maintain your inventory buffers where you would like them to be, then you must shrink those buffers. The best solution would be to use adjustment factors downwards, because, for instance, and maybe as well temporarily disable some buffers and transition to make to order, which means lengthening lead times for some items, because you need to make sure that the inventory target and the buffer size you're running at is compatible with your capacity.
Yep. Okay. We're going to, by the way, there's a few questions around lead times and expectations from vendors in the Q&A section. We're going to get to that section here in a few minutes. So just if you can hold on those, we're going to cover that topic specifically. Let's talk about this issue of finite scheduling, Bernard.
Yeah, well, when we have capacity constraints, of course, we have those critical resources that we need to finite capacity schedule, and we can do this in Intuiflow both at S&OP, rough cut capacity planning level, and at fine capacity level. And the nice thing is that this finite capacity scaling is aligned with the buffer priorities, so that will help pace the requirements throughout the chain to the suppliers, consistent with what we can actually achieve.
Yep, absolutely. Another one. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, so another factor that we obviously want to consider is our availability of materials, because if we are approving work orders that are going to go into the production schedule where we know we've got material shortages, which is often the case, that people will kind of override that, or we're going to be able to expedite that material in, we're just creating more signal distortion. So you really want to be more judicious and careful about, noise distortion that you're introducing yourself. That hoarding behavior that we're talking about here is a noise distortion introduced for no logical reason other than, paranoia about the lack of supply or things like that. And we can inflict a lot of damage into our own environment by overreacting. And clearly we want to avoid that. And then the other thing is, relative to order approval, let's continue to wait as long as possible, because anything that we're tying to future events is likely to change. And we'll talk about this a little bit when we get into the lead time topic in more detail, because even though suppliers are extending lead times out, there's a number of other factors that go into that discussion that you need to be considerate of before you come to any hard conclusions about how you're going to react and address on that. Anything there you want to add, Bernard?
Yeah, and I think it's particularly important to make sure we minimize working process in the manufacturing processes. And this is what we call chop the release. I think you alluded to that in the scheduling and execution process. Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, I was visiting a plant that is facing huge demand and cannot cope with this demand, but still they have working process of 3 to 4 weeks on the shop floor, whereas and this is way too many work orders that are released. So they are releasing the work orders too early, which means that those work orders spend too much time on the floor, with many reprioritization and a lot of issues. So by shortening this lead time with proper run buffer work scheduling, we would be able to get the products to the market faster.
Yep. Want to take this one?
Spike detection is always quite of a trial and error process when we implement a new model, and it's particularly critical in the type of situation some companies are facing. When you're short on capacity, you really need to understand and monitor closely the spikes, because there may be an opportunity for you to deal with longer lead time, make to order, and negotiate service for some clients. Would you like to cover the distribution portion?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, and when you're supplying a distribution network, Ddmrp is providing a very nice process, which is fair share allocation or prioritized share, that will help you balance the inventory throughout the network and take into account scarcity situations, and make sure that you deploy the inventory to the right place. Nothing would be worse than deploying excess inventory somewhere when you're lacking inventory elsewhere.
Yeah, for those who are not familiar, this is a screenshot from our distribution model, which automates this area of deployment of material out to, your spoke locations using this prioritized share. These little graphics here that we see, let me get a pointer going here, that you see here show what the deployment quantities are before and after. And it gives you a sense of, we're trying to get everybody to an equal level of saturation, first in the red zone, then in the yellow, and then up to top of green. So it's a very handy application module that fits within our Intuiflow solution for distribution networks and things of that nature. And it's using the buffer status as a way of really doing that fair share allocation.
The last tactic, is a bit across the board, but it's really using the visibility that the demand-driven operating model is providing on inventory buffers, time buffers, capacity buffers, to align everybody within the company, and potentially as well with suppliers and or customers, key customers, to the same visibility and same understanding of what the priorities are, what the current performance is, and how are we progressing. This is an example, for instance, from one of our clients that is facing that type of situation. We see that current inventory is below target, but improving, and everybody has the same understanding of the situation within the company.
Yep. Okay, so hoarding, excess demand, a number of suggestions there on things that you can look at to deal with getting better control of that side of the signal. Let's shift our focus now to just the actual issue of, availability of materials, where, because of impacts from our suppliers with limited capacity, we've got some commodities that are facing worldwide constraints, whether it's chips. I saw issues with resin, steel in certain cases. There's a number of products out there that have been problematic for people. And clearly we need some better tactics to address that. So Bernard, why don't you talk us through these couple that we've illustrated here?
Well, the first tactic is not really a Ddmrp tactic or a demand-driven tactic. It's really to get alignment and frequent reviews with suppliers, at least key suppliers. I had discussions recently with a supply chain director for a corporation that was telling me, we have plan A and then plan B and then plan C, and plan C doesn't work, so we have plan E now. And this is really collaboration, very frequent calls and meetings, and alignment with suppliers. So definitely the visibility with the demand-driven framework can help fuel this collaboration. The second tactic or question we are having is, what should we do with the buffers? Should we reduce them, buffers of purchase lots, or should we increase them? And this will really depend on this interaction with a supplier. If you have a very close interaction with a supplier, maybe you will be able to move to a temporary organization with more frequent deliveries, etc. And maybe you will be able to get better alignment, and eventually reduce those buffers, which will bring some relief to the supplier. Reversely, you may want to increase some buffers because you don't have visibility, because you don't have good collaboration, because you face more and more issues, and you need to compete with other customers of your suppliers, and you need to increase those buffers and safety factors. So there is no black and white answer to it.
Yeah, I think the comments that you've already made around, making sure that they're aligned to what your capacity from a production standpoint can consume. I think in the case of where we would increase buffers, it's more likely going to be the level of unreliability from the vendor. In other words, whatever their lead time is, if they're having problems achieving that because of like labor shortages, because COVID impacts or whatever, then you clearly want to make sure that that buffer is configured to give you a little more resilience for that. But if that's not the case, if they're reasonably reliable and they're meeting their supply order dates, then maybe you can harmonize your dimensions, maybe more in the smaller direction, by making it easier for them to get through a rotation of SKUs or things like that, so that they're continuing to provide everybody with stock at certain times to harmonize kind of the signals across the layers in the supply chain here. Anything you want to add?
No.
Yep. Execution alerts. This is, I think, an area that in the Ddmrp area is often really probably not as deeply appreciated as it should be. This is a screenshot of the dashboard from Intuiflow, which shows kind of your frequency of inventory alerts in rank order of severity. Current inventory alerts are your most critical. Those are stock out situations, followed by material synchronization alerts, which are going to be not stocked out today, but are at deep risk of having exposure within the item's lead time. And then beyond that would be projected stockouts, which don't fall into either of those first two categories, but where the buffer is starting to get to its low end and may, based on run rate, breach its stocking level or its run out. And this facility, to me, is about prioritizing expedite actions. This is about, we don't have enough material. Which are the orders, which are the vendors that we need to go after to try to close the gap? And it's not about due date performance, it's about buffer status, right? I can have items that are overdue where I don't really care because, quite honestly, that buffer may have enough material. And so I should not be focused on, these are the ones that are all overdue. I should focus on the ones that are exposing my buffer, my ability to maintain constant availability at a current point in time. So the execution alerts are really effective in Intuiflow at driving those actions. There's a in place or within the software, you can keep supply order notes and keep those frequent, and there's signals within that part of the application that allows anyone on the system to be able to see that, yeah, some corrective actions in flight, we've been in touch with that vendor. And so it really improves organizational visibility to what are the firefighting tactics we have on hand or in place, and how are we progressing with those. This next tactic, Bernard, I think appreciate you covering, because I think this is perhaps one that could be very helpful for a lot of clients who are utilizing offshore suppliers and may need to make judgment calls between sea-based transport versus air freight. Can you comment?
Yeah, this is a tactic we developed for some clients that are having a lot of offshore supplies that are supposed to come ocean freight, but if you do not, if you let the products go on a vessel, sometimes they will arrive too late and you will be in danger and you're stuck because basically the products are in a container somewhere on water, and you're just the only thing you can do is just wait. So with some customers, we developed a discipline with clear visibility of in transit on water and clear visibility as well on what is due to be shipped and still within manufacturing. And what we do is basically using the S&OP projections in the S&OP module. We identify situations by exception where we may want to consider before putting some products on water to whether or not we should fly them in order to avoid a stockout. And it's of course a decision for the planner to decide on this expediting action or not. And this proves very effective.
Yeah. Yep. So a couple others, prioritized by daily usage or number of demand pulls. In other words, those that are less frequent runners, we can, perhaps, treat differently than those that are really kind of the bread and butter items within. And I like also using a daily usage value. In other words, if I want to look at my vendors, which of the vendors do I buy the most material? What, in terms of the dollars flowing through our plant, who are the vendors that have the most responsibility there? And by really making sure that we work high to low down that list to make sure we've got solid collaborations in place with those vendors, it's going to put us in a much, much better position. Frequency of demand pulls and other tactics, there's a lot of visibility to that kind of data in the system, can be really quite useful as to where to focus. We did a workshop with one of our larger clients a few weeks ago and shared some of these tactics, and they definitely walked away with some, better ideas on how they could work with their team to make sure that, those top priorities were getting better focus. Bernard, why don't you comment on this next example?
Well, the next example is really just making sure that at least for critical suppliers, we share potential future demand. We know it will be false. We know this is a forecast, but in many cases, this is something that will be valuable information for the supplier to book some capacity, etc. And in some cases, and we'll get to that later on when we have very long lead time, that will be the base for the liabilities or commitments we need to take with those suppliers.
Yep. I think you've probably caught on. We're trying to help avoid the bullwhip here. So by level loading our supply signals, what we're advocating here is that we can improve our collaboration with that vendor if we quit sending them as much noise. Even before COVID, customers would tell us about how some of their most difficult suppliers became their best ones once the client themselves had implemented Ddmrp, because they were sending a more reliable signal to the supplier that made it easier for them to be successful. So we want to try to get more balance, more control on this. And most of the actions that we see are actually pointed in the wrong direction, that are going to contribute or exacerbate the bullwhip effect. And that's the last thing that we want when we're trying to get more control. If we can level load supply signals, we can build a better foundation. If they understand that you're trying to, help them help you, I think you can really build a better partnership with them to be able to deliver on these kind of concepts. And at the end of the day, we can only consume so much material, right? We only have so much production capacity. I don't care if you're making soft drinks or tires or whatever, there's only so much capability you've got. And in fact, because of COVID, the bias in that available capacity is going to be to the short side because of unexpected absences of staff because of, illness, or, they were diagnosed as positive with the virus. Now they're not available. More often than that, your production is going to be below your planned schedule or scheduled production, just because of other unforeseen events or things that are happening. And so, if we continue to oversaturate that, we're just actually making things a lot worse for us. And then spot buy, we're seeing some of this where whether it's, there's a unique market opportunity, we actually have a feature we're planning to implement which would disqualify supply outside of a certain window. In other words, that there may be some of that supply that's out there. Again, with these extended lead times, people are asking for reservations, if you will, against some future capacity or future supply far down the road. If we include those in our net flow equation, then they will shorten or reduce the likelihood of a new order being generated because it looks like you're over top of green. And by creating a feature that would disqualify that stuff that's outside that window until it gets kind of within the lead time horizon, we enable ourselves to bring a little more effective signaling within the Ddmrp buffers that are out there. So, you got to be judicious with these tactics. I think, again, as I had mentioned, Goldrat's advice was always wait as long as possible. When we go in the other direction, we are in bringing more challenge into our environment. So we've got to be really, really careful about this. Anything you want to add there, Bernard?
No, I think we should jump to the last slides that refer to long lead times.
Yep. So I shared this slide yesterday, and I think this was a very important slide. The core of this is this idea that we have customer tolerance times, that we have to ship within so many days of when we get their firm order. And that's typically far shorter than the cumulative lead times that we're dealing with. And the point of this chart is that as we look at the disparity between our customer tolerance time and our cumulative lead time, the longer that signal stretches, the more we inherit two critical things. First is forecast error rate. So companies that are asking for order commitments 600 days from now are just fooling themselves that you're actually going to want that material. And if you follow along and give them firm, contractually bound commitments for material that far out, when typically it might be a 90-day lead time, you are putting yourself in a very, very difficult position because between now and then, that 600 days, the world is going to change. And so if you're getting into these situations, I think you've got to really be careful about what you're signing up for, because what will ultimately happen here is while we're dealing with all this supply constraints, what's the other side of the bullwhip going to be? It's where we're going to have inventory out the wazoo because it's going to go in the other direction. And you can be sure that this is going to happen. And so the more we just kind of acquiesce to these conditions that are happening out in the market, the more dangerous we're going to be in a situation, some months down the road. But you can be sure it's going to happen. And that's where, the real economic impacts. And then obviously, in terms of production, the more we're guaranteeing things further and further out into the future, the more that becomes an issue in terms of delay accumulation or making things that are no longer needed in the market and misusing production capacity that's out there. So some further thoughts to think about in terms of longer lead time. Bernard, why don't you talk about this one from the standpoint of these long-term commitments?
Yeah, so we alluded to the situations when we have, for instance, electronic components with 2 years of lead time. A Ddmrp buffer with 2 years of lead time may not be very useful because you will compute something with an average day usage for 2 years. We know that committing any volume to 2 years out will be risk taking, and the demand-driven dynamics and mechanics themselves will not have that much. But what we see with some of our clients is that, in fact, of course, they need to place requirements, commitments 2 years out, but really their focus will be for the next weeks. And this may be 12 weeks, for instance, 3 months out, to really get the right cadence of deliveries lined up with the right execution priorities, and making sure that the supplier ships on time, etc., etc. So most of the time, what we end up doing is having the long-term requirement supported by the S&OP or the Ddmrp process, running the simulations out, and then making an educated decision on how many or how much should I commit on this component. But then set a buffer that will be on a short-term horizon to really monitor the execution on this shorter horizon, for instance, about 3 months. And this gets back to the discussion we had earlier on the open order topic, because we do not want, even if we placed tentative cadences to the customer over the long run, we don't want all of those tentative cadences to be taken into account in the net flow equation.
Yep. And I think this is obviously where the vendor collaboration is really critical. They're looking for more raw volume commitments, but as you get closer, there's maybe some mixed changes that can be accommodated. And then obviously what your true call-offs are, what are the releases against that longer term commitment? We want to keep those horizons as short as possible, because that will allow us to do a much better job of avoiding, that bullwhip effect of going in the other direction, where now all of a sudden we're sitting on a flood of inventory that doesn't really align with what our market needs are at a given point in time. So I know there's no, clear and concise do this or that, but these are the concepts that you should be following to address these kind of requirements. Reduce lead time factors on your extra long lead time items. If you don't do that, the lead time factor, for those of you who are familiar with DDMRPs, that's the percentage of usage over the lead time that goes into the red zone base. If you continue as the lead times get longer to not adjust that, you're going to end up fattening up that red zone so much that you're going to contribute further to this issue of trying to hoard material when you really can't do that. So we've actually got a number of examples where we're understanding that clients are getting longer lead times. We're working in the other direction to then try to streamline down the red zone sizes to ensure that we don't fully or further distort kind of the buffer zone values as a result. Bernard, you want to talk about items 3 and 4?
Item 3 is really using the projection and the simulation engine to work by exception, because you have thousands of parts, thousands of components, for instance, and you cannot go look at each of them. So really what matters is running the simulation and then using the reports that are exception-based to identify the items that really deserve attention on the medium term, or say, for instance, maybe 12 weeks out to monitor those risky parts. And the last one is kind of an extension of the logic we use for the distribution aspect. When you're having a component that is under allocation and you cannot fulfill all of the demands, it's looking at the net flow equation of the parent items that are consuming this component in their bill of material to run a fair share allocation on those plants. And I think that's it for the tactics.
Yep. And Corey and Carlos, I think we've addressed the questions that you posted in the Q&A. So thanks for those questions. And if you've got any follow-ups, why don't you send those along right away, because we're going to be closing up here as we're pretty much out of time. So let's just kind of summarize here. What we want to do is resist that urge to overprotect our position. As hard as that can be, and I fully appreciate that the pressure you get from senior management and things like that. But if you can really get control of that, you're going to be in a better place. Utilize those buffer signals to prioritize the corrective actions. You're not going to have the ability to do everything that seems to need attention. So where you want to focus is where you can get the most leverage from that. And that's where I think, if you remember, I talked about set the strategy, make sure the stakeholders are all on board with how you're going to try to manage given the challenging environment that you're experiencing. Make sure that you've got buy-in, you've got clear direction as to how we want to approach things so that you can prioritize. That's really going to give you the best results a long time. Keep in mind your both supply and production constraints. Don't let this over distortion of the signaling get in the way of being able to get to a more operationally balanced way of managing. So I think if you're really focused on this well, you're going to be in a better position, recognizing that there are limits. And if you stay kind of closer or within those boundaries and don't just take that raw signal unvarnished, if you will, through your business, you're going to be in a much, much better place. And at the end of the day, it's about building trust and collaborative relationships with your suppliers, because you can get to a better place, but you've got to work together with your community, those on the inbound side from a supply standpoint, with your customers as well, trying to help them understand you're doing everything you can to help them, but if they continue to oversaturate the demand signal, they're really not going to help themselves at the end of the day. And then my final bit of advice, this is going to go the other direction. You can be sure of it. We're going to find ourselves all of a sudden with way too much inventory because we took way too heavy of corrective actions. And obviously we don't want that to happen as well, because the risk of heavy, obsolete, and expired inventory is going to be very, very high when that time comes, and it's coming. I'm not going to venture a guess here, but we know it's going to happen. Just like you kind of saw in the real estate boom and bust, we're going to see the same thing happening in this space at some point, not too far down the road. So any final comments, Bernard?
No, I'm hoping this was useful and will give some ideas on how to cope with the current situations.
Yep. Well, I want to thank everybody for your participation today. Hopefully this was helpful. We've really enjoyed having the opportunity to work with all of you, but clearly there's no silver bullet answers on a lot of these issues that we're running into. So if you want to have follow-up conversations, please feel free to reach out, and we'll do everything we can to assist as you go forward. We've got another day of agenda tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you all then. So until we meet again, have a great day, and we'll talk to you real soon. Thanks, everybody.